Hey, Travis here at Exercise Lab with another video for you guys today. So I'm a doctor of physical therapy for those of you who don't know me. And today I'm here to talk to you guys about a pesky little problem called iliotibial band or IT band, syndrome, and often manifests itself as kind of outer knee pain which has to do with this big sheet of fascia that attaches to a muscle up here. I'll be talking to you guys about a little bit about what it is, how to sort of address it if you've already been diagnosed with it, you have it, and what you can sort of do at home, hopefully before you have to go down the road of, doing more serious interventions for it. Because many times if you get in front of it, it's a fairly easy thing to address. And even if it's been ongoing for many of you, if you haven't been doing the right things, sometimes fairly simple stuff can also work. So I'll be talking to you guys about how to deal with it and all that good stuff. So go ahead and stay tuned if you guys want to learn more. All right, so sometimes a pretty simple place to start, with any type of an issue like this is on the ground. Foam rolling is often one of my go-tos. I think stretching can be a little bit overrated. It's something that sometimes can help certain people. It's often the case when you have a long-standing issue. You may have some range of motion restrictions and need to address those. But it's not often the case that it's because of a range of motion restriction that you have the issues. It's usually kind of an artifact or something that falls out of having, poor movement quality, muscle activation, weaknesses, and things of that nature. So, what I like to do a lot more of the time is foam rolling. Now, we have this prominence. You sort of know where your hip bone is here. And ideally, you either want to be above or below it. Now, we have this, TFL muscle, which is a hip flexor, and basically comes down to this big sheet of fascia we have on the sheet of our side of our leg. And so I want to basically roll that IT band. And I've shown this in some other videos, but I'll review it here again. For some of you, this might be a pretty tender roll initially, so you might not need to, use a real strong roller. But, you can kind of figure out what you need. If you're really having to bite down on something, that's obviously an indication that this probably needs some attention. That being said, you don't have to completely pulverize yourself either. So if you have access to a softer roller, start there. Cut yourself some slack if you want. Stacked is going to be, more pressure, so that's generally going to be a harder place. If this is really tender, so you can always drop that top leg in front. So right now I'm going to be just below where that bone is, and I'm going to basically just drag my leg. I'm trying to relax it the length of the roll. And again, I could drag it with this, foot in front to kind of guide me. Again, I could go into a more stacked position if it's not a real difficult roll for me. And so again, I can bias a little more of that quad, vastus lateralis, which is sort of that outer part of my quadricep. I can even come back a little bit too, even almost getting into my hamstrings, bicep femoris, territory. And so I'm going to basically just roll that area from about there to there and just try to work out some of that tenderness. It's often the case it's going to be a little more tender as I get closer to the knee. So, certainly if something's really feeling especially tender, you can hold it there. If you get on something where you feel like that's the painful spot, and it feels pretty localized, you can certainly hold it there for some breath counts as well. Anything that would be, shooting down your leg, giving you tingling or, making it feel like it's legitimately worse, obviously avoid that. But if this feels like it's just kind of that, hurts so good, as we like to call it, where it's tender, but it's doable, it feels like it kind of needs it, then certainly, give it some breath sometimes. Activating that parasympathetic nervous system can sometimes help the muscles to relax a little bit. Once you've had enough of the IT band, though, then you can go right above the bone to where your TFL is. And for that, again, I could just kind of stay right in here. Again, I'm using my foot this way. I could come in front if I wanted to. And again, I can come even more forward into the hip flexor territory, almost getting more into that psoas rectus femoris area. But, kind of anywhere in that vicinity is a good area to sort of get after for the TFL hip flexor region, okay? And so you can just, again, hold it there if you need to, but also give it some more dynamic rolling. And again, I'm assuming this would be my symptomatic side, but you definitely want to compare it to your other side too. It's not always a one-to-one. You actually could be pretty tender on your, other side, and that would probably indicate maybe you just need it in general. But sometimes people actually will even feel more tender on their good leg, and that can also be a sign that maybe you're just overutilizing some muscles there, perhaps guarding and trying to, protect an area that's painful. So sometimes it's not always a one-to-one. It might be more tender on that painful side, but not always. So you have to kind of play around with it and kind of see how it's shaping up. But in general, once you've done this a handful of times, it should feel like it's getting easier. It shouldn't feel quite as tender anymore. It should feel like it's easing up. In the very beginning, it can be a bit tough, but usually if you stay with it, a couple weeks in, it definitely should feel like it's getting, pretty easy. And at a certain point, it should feel like it's just pressure, but not bad at all. Very doable, pretty smooth, all considered. And so that's foam rolling for the IT band TFL area. And so just for the sake of completeness, again, stretching is not necessarily something I'm a huge fan of, but if you did want to stretch this area in a simple enough way that's laying on the ground, you basically can take this leg over. And, again, I'm going to try to cross this leg into adduction because it's an abductor and it's a flexor. Now, it is in hip flexion, which is one of the reasons I like the standing stretch a little more, which I'll show you guys in a moment. But this would be how you do a laying version of it, okay? So I'm basically just trying to wind this up and kind of lengthen this area, so in through here. And so, I do feel a little stretch there. It's not, a super intense one. Obviously, if your starting position was here and you could barely get into it, again, your tendency is going to be to sometimes rotate your lumbar spine. So those of you who have some low back considerations, you might want to be a little careful here. You certainly could probably put a bolster under this leg here if this was a little too much on that lumbar spine. But you can kind of set your pelvis, so hopefully it's not going with you too much. And then you just hold out here until you feel a good stretch, and then off you go again, somewhere in that 30-60 second vicinity. A little more if you really feel like you need it. Compare to your opposite side, see how things shake out. But depending on how symptomatic you are and kind of how in tune with your body you are, being on the ground can often be a simple place to start. It's oftentimes where a lot of therapy clinics will start you is on a table, right? So you can kind of imagine this is on a table in a way. And for those of you who have IT band pain, it may be the case that recruiting the glutes is a difficult thing to do. And so a very simple way to do a clam, which is sort of a training wheels version of another movement I'll show you guys in a moment called a monster walk or a monster step, is basically just to put this thing around your knees and try to separate your knees. And as I'm separating them, I can feel my TFL muscles are somewhat leveraged because I am in hip flexion now, and I'm doing abduction, which is actually what those muscles do. But if I pay attention to it enough, where I'm trying to engage my gluteal muscles and trying to really get that mind-muscle connection, sometimes actually sending your feet into the floor a little bit as you spread can help you kind of bias a little bit more of the glutes. And so this would be a way to do what we call like a supine, or a lying clam, which can be an easy place to start. And if that feels like that's going pretty well, or that's easy enough, too easy, whatever, again, you could obviously add tension to the band, but just to show you guys the other version, you keep the abdominals a little engaged so you're not just totally, flat here. And then you can basically do the same thing. This would be more for this thigh, although this leg does have to do something more isometrically. And so again, I'm just going to try to send my mind, again, if my hip bone is here, I'm trying to send my mind kind of right behind it where that glute medius lives. And that's, again, the muscle that's going to help counteract some of that TFL work. And I'm going to feel that right away. And so obviously, if my left side was the side that isn't feeling so hot, I would want to try to spend some time over there as well. It doesn't have to be super strenuous stuff. You can start out with some pretty high reps. Really just want to make sure you're starting with a tension that allows you to feel like that muscle's working, and hopefully the TFL is not shouldering all the work, so to speak. And so whatever tension allows you to make sure you're feeling it in the right spot, I'd say start there. Certainly you can do higher repetitions, 15, 20, even up to 30 if you want. If you're blowing past 30, it's probably a little bit too easy. You can maybe add some more tension. But, again, depending on how symptomatic you are, that might be a good place to start. See how things shake out. How do you feel later that day into the next day? And then you can kind of, move along accordingly. If things are a little more symptomatic the next day or so, I'd probably just say start there. Obviously, if it's progressively getting worse, then you want to stop altogether and go get checked out. But if things are feeling like they're maybe a little more tender, that could be growing pains. See what things feel like over the next couple of days. And if it's not too much worse for the wear, you can stay at it and see how it goes. But obviously listen to your body. And if that sounds like a little bit too much trial and error for you, then certainly obviously go checked out. And when in doubt, you always want to go get checked out. But this is for those of you who are trying to do a more DIY version. Maybe you already know what you have. You've already kind of been diagnosed with IT band syndrome and all that good stuff. So if that is the case, you guys can try doing some clams just to try to establish that mind-muscle connection with the glutes, and then see if you guys can carry that over to standing, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so a place I do think your time will be pretty well spent in the standing department is doing active hip abduction to recruit the muscles, again, that sit right behind, kind of in that gluteus medius department, those hip abductors. But this is an abductor extensor rather than an abductor flexor, which again, that TFL is. And so, the monster walks is a really popular one. You sort of crouch, you get into a slightly crouched position, you take a side step. And again, I just have a loop band on. In the early days of this channel, the loop bands with the, fabric material weren't as popular. I've definitely converted over to them though, largely because I think they just stick a lot better. Those old Perform Better bands, which, I still do use and I use in certain applications, they just slide around a lot easier. And so I think this is nice because it's a little more resistance, plus it also sticks to you better. So I'd recommend, finding some of those more fabric style bands. And again, I don't endorse any particular ones because I'm not affiliated with any, but I just have found some that I like. And so I can put the link to the bottom for those of you guys who are interested. And so again, you basically just want to do an abduction maneuver. And again, because the TFL can help, some of you might notice, and especially if you're inclined to go a little forward as you do it, you're going to get that TFL, which is not really going to help you. So the devil is in the details on some of these movements. And so you want to get either a straight plane abduction, where I'm going straight to the side, And so again, I can do a step, come back to the middle type of thing, or I can do the step the way you guys probably see it if you watch the Olympics, and then they, or athletes do this a lot, they step to the side. And so again, going toward that direction is going to be more, recruiting that side, but I still have to do stabilization on the other side. So certainly, you always want to make sure things are good and balanced, so it shouldn't feel like one side is a lot weaker than the other. And for many of you who've had some long-standing pain, you may be weaker on that involved side. So certainly, you might need to do some extras. But there's no reason why it has to only be straight plane. Sometimes I'll also go straight, but then I'll bias a little extension. So I'm kind of going back a little bit, and I might even go back even more. And the more you start to go back, the more you're going to get that glute max, which is, again, a big hip extensor. But you can kind of work on some extension abduction. So sometimes I'll do sort of a, straight across, so you imagine like a 9 o'clock to maybe a 6, so I might do more 7 to 9, 7, 8, 9 if I was standing on a clock. So you imagine midnight's in front of me kind of thing. So, watch your 6, right? So that'd be straight back. And so, anything kind of in that vicinity is going to be a nice department. And so again, you might want to compare to your good side, make sure as I'm working those maneuvers, it's pretty evenly matched. But, again, I can make that more dynamic, or I might be going back, as opposed to going forward. But, you certainly, once you're going back, so if I go back a certain distance, if I have a window I'm going to work, rather than going forward on the way back, you can just turn around, just do a 180, then all of a sudden I'm going back now, working those same angles. So kind of a nice dynamic way to work some hip abduction. Take some pressure off that TFL because you're going to be recruiting the one that sits behind it a little bit more. And actually, as I extend my hip, I'm going to be getting lengthening there. So you actually get range of motion, much like that stretch will do for you, but in a more dynamic way. It's going to activate your glutes. So you definitely get the best of both worlds. That's there for you, sort of the monster walk variations. All right, so as we discussed, stretching isn't necessarily my go-to. It wouldn't be the first thing I do. Certainly wouldn't be, a big part of my program. I think it's often an overused intervention. It is often the case that sometimes we may have range of motion restrictions. But as I discussed, foam rolling can often be a nice way to get at that, as well as other just kind of active range of motion type of things. Static stretching, again, though, does have a time and a place. If you guys want to do that, a very basic one. So again, if my left IT band, so, that TFL tends to be a hip flexor and an abductor. So if I were to adduct and extend my hip, I can potentially, stretch that area. And so many times, if you can kind of drape the foot behind, and then you just kind of point your hip where you're going to feel that stretch. So I'm bringing my leg into adduction across my midline, and I'm just kind of dropping my hip away. And again, I can, I can bias a little more extension or not, depending. You don't want to accentuate your lumbar curve too much, because then you're going to not necessarily be stretching that muscle as effectively. If you want to try to actually do the opposite and kind of tuck your pelvis a little bit, you're going to get a better stretch, because that muscle actually is a hip flexor. So again, I kind of lean away, maybe tuck my pelvis a little bit, and I do feel that stretch kind of right in that vicinity, right in here, which again is where that TFL lives, which attaches to that big sheet of fascia. So again, I can hang out here, and generally speaking, with static stretches, at a minimum probably 30 seconds, but I'd say somewhere probably 45, 60 will be a little bit more of that, getting that elasticity creep effect, which ideally you want. But again, I wouldn't necessarily go there as my first line, but that's there for you for those of you guys who want it. That's a standing IT band stretch. All right, so that's pretty much the video for today. Not a lot of equipment. Basically, just need a foam roller, maybe a loop band, loop band or two, depending on, how many progressions you want to do. And, I think it's a great place to start. So, certainly you can start first with just a foam roller alone, some stretching. You can try and do hip abduction type maneuvers, but without a loop band, it's kind of really difficult to tap into those. You certainly could do side lunging and things of that nature without any bands. It's just not going to get the abductors as much as it's probably going to get the quads and things like that. So, you can try to play around with it if you don't want to necessarily get all this stuff right off the bat. But luckily in this case, at least for this video, it's not a lot of equipment. And so really, I think a lot of it's just, again, getting at that motor control piece, making sure you're getting good recruitment of the glutes, not letting that TFL chime in and take over, which it loves to do. It's just an over-engaged muscle. It tends to, chime in whenever it can. And so oftentimes we're just going to have more active, hip flexors than hip abductors, hip extensors. And so then they kind of win that force pull, and so they end up doing more work than they should, translating more pain down the IT band and such. So, again, I would consider range of motion and even maybe foam rolling a little more symptom relief. Your long-term play is going to be getting that motor control, that hip abduction strength, and then managing the symptoms along the way as they arise. So I think, foam rolling can be a nice technique to kind of just prepare the tissue before a workout. Sometimes just kind of, give it a 60-30 second roller, maybe a minute or two tops. I don't do a whole bunch of foam rolling before I work out. If I have something I'm trying to address, though, I might foam roll after the workout or just at a separate time on its own during the day. And so certainly that's there for you. And you want to have good mobility in general. So it certainly stands to reason that if you have IT band pain, but your back is really tight, you have other restrictions, I'd want to try to pretty much address all that stuff. You really need to get out of pain? Probably not. But at the same time, you want to just have good movement quality in general. So sometimes you have to also kind of think big picture. Yes, you're trying to address a specific problem, but sometimes it's sort of the bigger picture that sets you up for more issues. And so you want to try to get after all that stuff to the degree you can, especially with longevity being on the table and not just training for tomorrow or the next day, but also trying to train for kind of the decades ahead and all that good stuff. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. More topics to come. I'll try to squeeze in some more equipment stuff as well as just rehab related issues, even longevity related issues. So please comment below. Let me know what you guys think. Any upcoming content I haven't covered you guys want to see, definitely chime in as well and let me know. And as always, I hope you guys have some fun.